Could everyone take their seats? Thank you. Honored guests, members of the press, Mrs. Ko, fellows and students of Tembusu College and other colleges and faculties. Welcome to the 23rd Tembusu Forum. Sometimes we use the forums to hold a debate, other times to celebrate or acknowledge a milestone. Tonight we're doing both. The Association of Southeast Asian States, or Nations, or ASEAN, is 50 years old as of last month. That's cause for celebration. But has ASEAN lived up to its potential? That's cause for debate. The invitation I posted on Facebook encouraging you all to come tonight was also encourage you to come with informed opinions, which I hope you'll express in the second half of the forum with these two microphones on either side of the room. And for those of you who are freshmen attending this for the first time, we give you students priorities at the microphones over the faculty. So please don't be shy about asking a question. But first, I hope you'll listen carefully, as I will, to the opinions of our three expert panelists who will be introduced and their discussion moderated by Professor Tommy Ko. Professor Ko is more than an expert on tonight's topic. He was witness to the founding of ASEAN in the late 1960s and has, as a diplomat, worked to maintain it in structure and spirit over the last half-century. And I know he remains a great supporter of ASEAN because he's recently spoken and written a lot on this topic. And you can read at least one of his essays on the Tembusu website, which I encourage you to do. And pull down under the news item and you'll see it there. So, to introduce the terms by which we might judge ASEAN's successes and shortcomings, let me invite to the podium the convener of the Tembusu Forum, Professor Tommy Ko.
Thank you very much, Greg. Very warm welcome to the student, especially the freshmen, for coming to the first forum of the 2017-2018 academic year. I've tried every semester to organize and chair two forums. So this is the first forum of this semester. Next month, in October, I will organize and chair a forum on the topic, will there be another war in the Korean Peninsula? Yeah. Once a month, I try to come in and have dinner with a small group of you. And next month, my special guest will be the North Korean ambassador to Singapore. My guest this month, two good friends, Sunny Liu, the graphic artist, the author of the famous or infamous book, The Art of Charlie Chan, and his publisher, Edmund Wee. Greg was right. On the 8th of August, 1967, 5 leaders of 5 Southeast Asian countries met in Bangkok. They represented Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines. And they took a leap of faith. They organized, or they established, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. The conditions in 1967 were not propitious, and many experts predicted that ASEAN would not have a very long life. In spite of the odds, the association survived and thrived and progressed. And 50 years later, I think we have much to celebrate. If you ask me, what are the 3 most important achievements of ASEAN? I would say first, that it's helped to keep the peace in Southeast Asia. For 50 years, we have enjoyed relative peace. And this is a very important achievement. Secondly, I would say that we have been able to enable the 10 economies to develop, to progress, but also to integrate with one another to form the ASEAN Economic Community. And it's an economy of about 2.4 trillion US dollars. It is either the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. And many experts predict that by 2030, ASEAN could be the 4th biggest economy in the world. This is a very considerable achievement because it means raising the standards of living of our 630 million people. It means reducing poverty. And I would say the third biggest achievement of ASEAN is that it's a force of peace. It is a force of peace not just in Southeast Asia, but in the Asia-Pacific region. ASEAN has tried to promote peace both by using the economic instrument, free trade agreement, and comprehensive economic partnership agreement, but also by convening various inclusive forums to bring all the great powers and other stakeholders together for dialogue. So in this way, ASEAN has proven itself to have played an indispensable role as a convener and neutral chairman of the regional architecture. So to me, although ASEAN has many imperfections, you can't take away these three important achievements from ASEAN. This evening, we are in for a treat. I've invited three good friends and experts of ASEAN to speak to us. And they would stay behind and answer your questions. I would also like to introduce some good friends who have joined us. My 4 colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Gerard Ho, the Director General for ASEAN. And 3 of his colleagues, the Deputy Directors, Harry Goh, Tam Bok Sian, and Tan Chi King. I would also like to warmly welcome from the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, the Yusof Ishak Institute, 3 good friends. The first one was one of my gurus when I had the unusual privilege of helping to draft the ASEAN Charter, Dr. Temsak Palanupap Chalam, Mr. Mo Tusa, and I wouldn't introduce the speakers. So let me now proceed to introduce each of the 3 speakers in turn, beginning with Dr. TANG Siew Mun. Dr. TANG Siew Mun is the head of ASEAN Studies at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, the Yusof Ishak Institute. He's a gift to Singapore from Malaysia, as he had previously worked at Malaysia's leading think tank, the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, whose founder, the late Tan Sri Nordin Sopi, was a very good friend. Siew Mun is one of these, how do I say, either well-educated or over-educated scholars. He had studied at 4 universities, beginning with the University of Malaya, and then the King's College London, then Claremont in California, then Arizona. He is an expert on ASEAN, and I've invited him to share with us his personal evaluation of the achievements and failures of ASEAN over the last 50 years. Siew Mun, please.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Professor Tommy Koh, for the kind introduction. As to whether I'm a gift to Singapore, it remains to be seen. I'll try not to disappoint. My colleagues was asking, why am I a gift to Malaysia? Maybe the Malaysians are very generous people, perhaps do not know as well. Thank you to the Tembusu College and to Professor Tommy Koh for the kind invitation to not just invite me, but my colleagues, 2 of us will be speaking, and my other colleagues here as well, to share with you some of our thoughts on ASEAN And this is a very special year for us. It's ASEAN's 50th anniversary, the Golden Jubilee. And next year is also equally special, where Singapore will assume the ASEAN chairmanship. So we will be entering we are entering two very exciting years, yeah. And as our colleagues from MFA would say also, two very tiring years, yeah. Professor Tommy Koh is famous for his 3 points. Yeah, he's able to dissect and to explain very complex political issues in 3 points. But I am nowhere near Professor Tommy Koh's stature, so I will try to share some views in perhaps 10 points. First, ASEAN is a work in progress. It is far from perfect. This is something of an evolution. It's not a complete project, which means there are lots of things that needs to be fixed. And more importantly, it gives us an opportunity to indulge, to participate, and to give color, to give life into the project that is ASEAN. So if it's a fixed project, the door is closed. But it's an evolving project, it's an ongoing project. This is something that you would have a chance as a young leader, and as you mature, as you progress through your career, and your children as well would participate in. So this is a project will be handed from one generation to another, and I hope this is a project that will never end. If ASEAN ends, that is the end of ASEAN. That is the end of Southeast Asia, perhaps. And I think we should take the label of work in progress in a positive sense. Second point. Second, ASEAN is celebrating its Golden Jubilee, but in reality, we should ask ourselves, is ASEAN really 50 years? If we take the 1967 as a starting point, where the Bangkok Declaration was signed and ASEAN 5, the 5 ASEAN founding members established ASEAN, yes, we are 50. But I would prefer to take another yardstick, which is 1999, where ASEAN became 10, where the ASEAN that we see today, with the inclusion of the new member states, starting from Brunei and ending with Cambodia in 1999. In that sense, ASEAN as a political entity, as a collective that we see today, has only been 18 years old, right? So perhaps in a more light-hearted manner, we have a choice of looking at ASEAN as 50 years old or 18 years old, midlife crisis or teenager, all right? Both has its positive and negative. 50 years old, maybe a bit richer. 18 years old, you're still beholden to your parents, a bit temperamental, but also lots of opportunities. Literally, the world is your oyster. Third, I've been given the remit to speak on achievements. One of ASEAN's achievements, I think Professor Tommy Koh has mentioned a few, and I will not repeat them, but another important achievement is ASEAN has united Southeast Asia. What do I mean by this? Yeah, I am, I think, old enough to know or to remember the Cold War, where Southeast Asia was divided between us and them, the communists and non-communists, where ASEAN was just basically in 1967, essentially maritime Southeast Asia, whereas the continental, the Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, they are literally in a world of their own, relatively disconnected. This is an age where there's no internet, there's no Asia, right? We're really disconnected, we do not know each other. So ASEAN is divided economically, politically, ideologically. But with ASEAN, we have embraced, we have bring friends and old enemies into the fold, right? We see communism as a threat. Most of our countries, including Singapore, have fought with varying degrees, politically, diplomatically as well, the communist threat. But we have in our midst very good friends in Vietnam, which is still a communist country, Laos as well. So in that sense, in ASEAN, we have dismissed, we have gone beyond ideology and political system. We have embraced all the Southeast Asian countries except Timor-Leste, which hopefully, touch wood, it will come in years to come, when ASEAN would be 11. The other achievement of ASEAN is that it played the role of the convener. What do I mean by this, right? It has successfully been it has been the most successful East Asian forum where cooperation mechanisms such as the ASEAN Regional Forum, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, and East Asia Summit. All this happened because of ASEAN. Without ASEAN, there will be no foundation, there will be no glue to bring all these countries together to work together. And you notice that all these are essentially political security institutions where cooperation is hard to attain. Right? It is easier to work in economics where you can share benefits, you can have compromises, but to bring nation states to talk about issues of sovereignty, about national interest, is very challenging. And it takes it takes a lot of patience, as Professor Tommy Koh and his colleagues here today will tell you, that convening a meeting is not a matter of having the mic, having a rostrum, organizing the lunch, having the dinner, but you need to have the trust to get the support. Yeah, you need to have the stakeholders to attend meetings. So getting the leaders to attend the East Asia Summit is no easy feat. Yeah, and we should applaud ourselves as the only entity in the region that is able to do that at a point in time where even Japan and China could not and would not talk to each other. The leaders did meet, either indirectly or indirectly. I remember there was one episode where Koizumi, the Japanese Prime Minister, refused to talk to, or maybe the Chinese leadership refused to even see eye to eye. They did have a brief conversation because Prime Minister Koizumi had to sign a document, and the Japanese, they signed in the calligraphy, right? And he had to borrow a pen from the Chinese leadership. So at least in that moment, they shared officially in public a few words. So ASEAN plays that vital role in bringing the region together, bringing major countries, middle powers together. We have to ask ourselves, if ASEAN-led processes such as ASEAN Regional Forum is nothing more than a talk shop. We get that from academics, we get that from outsiders to say ASEAN is nothing. We are all talk, there's no function, we do not do anything. If that is the case, why do the intelligent people, the statesmen in the European Union, Canada, has been lobbying hard to join the East Asia Summit? Why do we see a long list of countries wanting to become ASEAN dialogue partner, right? From Turkey, from Mongolia, Sri Lanka, right? Papua New Guinea is still an observer state. So people are lining up to engage ASEAN. There must be a reason that points that we are doing something right. If it's a talk shop, it's a waste of time, why do we want to attend? For leaders to come all the way to Southeast Asia, it shows a lot of political commitment. So we should not sell ourselves short, and if somebody says that ASEAN is a talk shop, I think we should embrace that. But at the same time, we should also remind our friends we are more than that. Because where else can you find these kind of talk shops, right? Diplomacy begins by talking. War starts by people not talking to each other. You're in relationship soon, and maybe some already are. When you and your significant other, when you stop talking to each other, sign of trouble, right? So talk is good, yeah? Lastly, the fifth point. All Southeast Asian states are small in a relative sense, perhaps with the exception of Indonesia, right? ASEAN gives these small states bigger clout. Individually, the Americas, the EUs, the big powers will not engage us. They are more likely to intimidate, they are more likely to order us around. But collectively with ASEAN, we invite them to our events, we set the agenda, we have clout. ASEAN stands tall in multilateral forums. We are the only entity that has been conferred observer status to the United Nations, right? As individuals, we are indeed small, but as TANG, we are greater, right? In terms of strength, in terms of ability, definitely in terms of our voices, right? So there is utility in ASEAN, and you can see the ASEAN emblem, 10 stalks of paddy sticking together. As individual stalk or straw, we are weak. Collectively, we are stronger. Not perfect. Collectively, we are still small in relative sense, but compared an alternative where if you stand alone, or if Malaysia stands alone, if Brunei stands alone. Challenges, there are many. That's why we are work in progress. it is important for us, for ASEAN to move forward, that we embrace and we recognize its challenges. We may not have all the answers, but at least we should be asking the right questions. First, I think one of the top challenges, at least from a political security perspective, is managing relations with the major powers. The elephant in the room, of course, is China. China has risen. China that we know today is a very different China. It's a very confident China, very powerful China, and a China that expects respect from everyone, right? And China expects some degree of leadership, and it would like to exercise its leadership in the region informally or formally. So how do we reach out, how do we engage China will be a very important question. At the same time, we are dealing with a friend has been using this term, a Trumpian presidency, which is very different America, and America we do not know. Yeah, we are almost about 9 months into the Trump presidency. We do not yet have a clear indication of what the Asia policy is. ASEAN does not have, US does not have an ASEAN ambassador. The US ambassador to Singapore has been nominated, but has not been confirmed yet. A lot of senior positions in the Department of State, in the Department of Defense is still unfilled in that sense. So where is America? Who is America? We are not sure. Some of us are even asking, when the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State speaks, does he speak for the President? What does the President think about Asia? What does the President think about ASEAN? Perhaps we will have a clearer indication when President Trump attends the East Asia Summit in November. Hopefully he will give a keynote and we have a clearer idea. But the question is, how do we avoid taking sides? How do we avoid entrapment in this major power rivalry that comes with the territory of major powers being together? America, China, Japan, and there's also India, right? In this mix, where does ASEAN find itself? How do we manage expectations? How do we enforce and affirm our centrality? How do we prevent being gobbled up by these major powers? Second challenge is the challenge of leadership. ASEAN has many leaders, but it's lacking of leadership. I'm not talking that we have no presidents or prime ministers. They are leaders in the respective countries. But can we see a clearly identified leader for ASEAN? Is it the chair? Is it the Secretary General? We are not so sure, right? Do we see leaders that speak with passion, that speak with enthusiasm about their vision for ASEAN? Where ASEAN leaders want to take the community? Do they put their political will to enforce, implement the blueprints, the commitments they have agreed to? Not too sure on that, but what's certain is that we need clearer leadership, because the leadership needs to communicate and interact with the people. Third challenge is the question of unity. Unity cannot be taken for granted, and perhaps is fraying as well. We see that in the Phnom Penh ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, where we failed to issue a joint communique for the first time. Is that the sign of things to come? Yeah, perhaps not, right? But what is worrisome is perhaps looking from the outside as an armchair general and a scholar who does not know much. I'm not in the room with the policymakers, but at least they may not have the same certainty or the same expectation, of what the bottom line is of fundamental issues. What's important from the region? We hear a lot of expectations or responses that self-interest overwhelm regional interests. How do we make the ASEAN leadership believe in the project that is ASEAN? The leadership that we have today is no longer the leadership in the 60s and 70s, where the regional ideal is still very important. Fourth point, I'll go very quickly, finish in the next 2 minutes if I may. Managing and responding to change. Whether ASEAN is in 50 years old or 18 years old, it needs to adapt to a changing environment. And I would like to specifically pick up one point. Will the consensus decision-making work for ASEAN? Is it still relevant? It works in an environment where the leaders are all on the same page, perhaps, where the leaders understand consensus decision-making does not mean veto, but perhaps now new generation of leadership would see consensus as veto, and veto is the ultimate protector of its national interests. Yeah? So the consensus modality does not work. We had a round of discussion in a special issue of ASEANFocus where we asked the policymakers, what does consensus mean? Then everybody tells us that consensus is not unanimity. You don't need everybody to agree. Somehow ASEAN works in a very unique way, right, which outsiders of us do not get access to. Is that still the mechanism? We have to ask the policymakers. My last point, how to engage the people. ASEAN, in many of its statements, communiques, chairman statements, blueprints, have always put the people at the center stage. The notion of people-oriented, people-centered is very important. It's a good move, it's progress, but the question is what's next? We cannot put out the bait to say that you are important. The people, yeah, is front and center of ASEAN. But at the same time, what a mechanism to engage the people. What a mechanism to engage young adults like you. What is your space in that, right? I do not have an answer, right? But most of the time, when we ask the question further, we go back to we run up against a wall that ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization. So where does the people-centeredness, people-oriented come in, and where is the intergovernmental? Where do they mix in that sense? I think we need to find a middle ground, yeah? Lastly, let me leave you with a few short words. ASEAN is not the panacea. It's not a shortcut to success. It does not provide any silver bullets, right? Do not expect ASEAN to solve all your problems, be it political, social, or cultural. It is not perfect, but let's not throw out the baby out with the bathwater, yeah? So do not give up on ASEAN. It is a fight worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you, Siew Mun. Siew Mun has left us with a few questions which we can discuss later on. One of these questions is whether is consensus still the best method of decision making in ASEAN, or should we consider alternatives like voting, taking decision by vote? He's also asked a big question: can ASEAN succeed in navigating between the United States and China, between China and Japan, between China and India, while keeping our independence and relevance? Can we be close to each of the major powers without becoming sucked into the orbit of any of them? I think these are good questions. And the last question is, can we translate what we say on paper, that ASEAN is a people-oriented, people-centered organization, into reality on the ground? How do we bring ASEAN on the ground? You know, how do we make ASEAN benefit the ordinary people of ASEAN? I think these are very good questions. I forgot to mention earlier that during the last 2 years, I've worked very hard to do something concrete for the 50th anniversary. I've edited a book on Singapore and ASEAN the last 50 years. This is launched at the annual ASEAN reception on the 22nd of August. And I've given Greg a copy. Maybe I'll give you another copy so you can put this in the reading room for the students to take a look at. On the 8th of August this year, the actual day of the 50th anniversary celebration, I was very privileged to have been invited by the current chairman of ASEAN, President Duterte, to attend a grand celebration of ASEAN 50th anniversary in Manila. And I was asked to attend this celebration and to receive a token on behalf of our first foreign minister, Mr. Rajaratnam. Mr. Rajaratnam had no children, and as I'm the trustee of his estate, the government asked me to represent him. So for me, that was a very moving occasion. I was not wrong to say Siew Mun is a gift from Malaysia, and the next speaker is a gift from India. This really shows you the reality, which is Singapore is so dependent on talented people who come to live here, work with us. Sanchita Basudas is an economist, a graduate of the famous Delhi School of Economics. She did an MBA in Singapore, was working in the private sector, and then decided to give up a well-paying job to join ISEAS. She's a leading economic scholar of the ASEAN Studies section. She's also the coordinator of APEC Studies at ISEAS. Sanchita writes a great deal and very well on the ASEAN Economic Community, on the TPP, on APEC. So it gives me very great pleasure to invite Sanchita to share with us your assessment of the success and disappointment of the ASEAN Economic Community.
Can you use the arrow keys to them?
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much to Ambassador Tomiko for his very kind introduction. And thank you to all of you. Thank you to Tembusu College for inviting me this evening to share some of my thoughts on what I do, economic regionalism. So I will narrow my focus on one of the many agendas of ASEAN, and I'll talk mainly about ASEAN's economic cooperation. I'll start quickly since timer is already on. So you must have seen these numbers very often in newspapers or in speeches from our political leaders, that the 10 Southeast Asian countries, they represent a GDP size of 2.5 trillion. And in terms of the purchasing power parity, ASEAN is the 4th largest economy after China, US, and India. And in terms of the economic growth, ASEAN is doing pretty well when we compare it to global economic growth. It's growing at 4.5% in the last couple of years compared to 3% of the world economy. ASEAN has it's the 3rd largest population in the world. So that shows its market size, the potential of a market size, why the private sector has to be in the region to do business in the region. And in addition to this, ASEAN has a very young population, like around 50% of ASEAN's population is below 30 years of age. This is compared to, say, 39% for East Asia and 34% for Europe. So this highlights ASEAN's capacity for current and future workforce. So ASEAN is big as a market. ASEAN has a potential in terms of the workforce. And lastly, ASEAN is highly integrated to the global economy. And this both because of market forces and institutional. My market forces, I mean by the private sector who are doing business in the region, and at the same time, they're trading and investing with China, Japan, Korea, US, Europe. And by institutional, I talk about the free trade agreements that ASEAN has signed with 6 of its trading partners. So total trade is 2.2 trillion in ASEAN, of which intra-ASEAN trade is highest for 25%. Then there is with China, EU, Japan, and US. For FDI, I've kept the slide specifically because when ASEAN thought to integrate more coherently in 2003, the main idea is to attract FDI in the region. The main idea, because around that time, China entered WTO, and we had the 97-98 crisis. And so the foreign investments were going to China or they were going to India, another big market near Southeast Asia. So our leaders, they wanted to bring back the investment to ASEAN. So FDI was very important for ASEAN. And in 2014, the ASEAN countries crossed the level of FDI flows. The China attracted that year. So these are the broad economic numbers for ASEAN. So now, in 2003, like Siew Mun mentioned earlier, like in 1999, we had all 10 ASEAN members. So soon after that, the Southeast Asian leaders thought of adopting this ASEAN Economic Community, and they announced in 2003 with the objective of a stable, prosperous, highly competitive ASEAN economic region. And then they said there'll be free flow of goods, services, investment, other resources in the region. And the deadline at that time was fixed for 2020, but somehow in 2007, 2008, when the political leaders realized that the global economy is changing very fast, they preponed the deadline to 2015. Following the 2003 announcement of AEC, the 10 countries signed the AEC blueprint in 2007 under Singapore chairmanship. And the blueprint basically gave the action lines. How are we going to meet these AEC objectives? What are the timelines? What are we going to establish in the next couple of years? So there was a clear blueprint, clear pathway for this AEC. And there was the key 4 pillars of AEC: single market production base, competitive economic region, economic equitable development, and integration into the global economy. Now, fast forwarding from 2003, we moved to 2015. We are in AEC now. So AEC is a reality. But before I move to what we have, how we have progressed under AEC, I have a couple of observations to share with you. ASEAN economic integration is incremental in nature. So we started the process, I would say, in 92, 93, when 6 ASEAN countries thought for ASEAN free trade area. Then they realized, let's do the services sector liberalization, then investment. So these happened much later in the 90s. So AEC came only in 2003. So we should not think like, oh, ASEAN is a very fast-moving process, a fast-moving policy. So it's a very incremental process. Second, it evolves with the changing global conditions. So what happened in 90s or say early 2000? Production network was forming in the region. I explained the private sector are no longer operating in one country, but they are spreading their operations, their production process across 2 or 3 countries. Then there was the Western countries were forming their own economic cooperation methods like the NAFTA, EU was expanding, China entered WTO, I mentioned, then there is the issue with the FDI. So it was continuously, the global economies are changing, so that's why ASEAN also thought it's as a reaction to these global mechanisms also. And finally, establishing AEC is not the end game. We will see a very different kind of ASEAN economic cooperation maybe 10 or 20 years down the line. So we should not say, oh, ASEAN is defined like ABC and we are going to see like this. No, like I said, it is a continual effort to facilitate the market-driven economic activities. And what is this market-driven activities? It's the private sector, the way they are behaving, and what is our governments doing? They're supporting the private sector. And that is what I mean, ASEAN facilitate the market-driven economic activity. And these economic activities are no longer in one country, so you need 10 countries and the bigger geographies in Southeast Asia. So now, what happened on 31st December 2015? We read in the newspaper that ASEAN has implemented 93.9% of the measures in the AEC blueprint. Yes, it's a very high implementation rate, and but many of us, especially from the business community, they complained like they didn't feel much about this 94% of the achievement. So what went wrong, or what went wrong in our understanding, or what went wrong in communication between the governments and the people? So when we look deeply in the AEC blueprint, there are 3 main observations. First, the headline commitments. Like I mentioned earlier, 4 pillars. Single market production base. That does not match with the action lines. You're only talking about free tariff reduction, but you're not promising much on standardizing your products. So that means you are doing a 25% of the whole job. So you cannot deliver on a single market production base. But people mostly read the headline numbers, and then they started being judgmental on how ASEAN has failed to deliver its promises. Many of the initiatives under AEC Blueprint, they were not uniformly implemented across ASEAN countries. Say, suppose there is this, ASEAN countries have committed, like they will be going for a national single windows. But if you have national single window in only 3 ASEAN countries and not in all 10, for the business community, it's hard to see the benefit. They're still working on both soft copy and the hard copy of their trading forms and the trading documents. And many of the AEC measures are not about concrete action in domestic economy. They are about exchanging ideas or building information, having websites. So I won't say it's anything wrong, because let's not forget that ASEAN has Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, who may not have complete understanding of something, say, competition policy. Why do you need it? How competition policy increases productivity of a country? Those are very technical subjects. So you need the initial discussions to make those countries come on board with you on these measures. For the key achievements under the trade in goods agreement, we are very proud in saying 96% of the goods trading in the region at the moment are all duty-free. There are a bit of the CLMV, the less developed ASEAN members have a longer deadline, but it's coming soon. Everything will be tariff-free by 2018, 2020. There is a lot of focus on trade facilitation. So this is a very key agenda for ASEAN, single window, trade repository. Single window is a e-customs facility for business people. Trade repository gives all information about trade and investment and non-tariff barriers in ASEAN country. So there are a lot of trade facilitation initiatives, but they're all work in progress, because some countries are advanced in this, some countries are taking some time. Then we have services sector agreement, where the ASEAN countries take a lot of pride in saying we have liberalized 101 subsectors. But we cannot see the benefits across the entire services sector. Like, for example, when we say logistics integration, logistics in the negotiation will be divided across 15 subsectors. And that's why we say 101 subsectors. It will be negotiated as warehousing, packaging, freight servicing. So if you're a businessman doing a combination of these things, you may find difficulty in doing business in other ASEAN countries. Where services sector is moving faster is the air transport facility. We have a very good open skies policies in ASEAN, which all ASEAN countries have adopted, except for a couple of protocol under the policy. We have signed 8 mutual recognition agreement for professionals. Yes, that's very good, but the problem is the flow of professionals are subject to national policies. So again, there are some ifs and buts with this. We have a very good investment document which talks about ASEAN as a single investment destination, and it talks about investment liberalization, protection. I would say it functions more as a promotion and facilitation document. Basically, it provides a lot of business confidence. Then we are increasingly talking about infrastructure. We have development gap initiative, where we try to narrow the development gap between the advanced ASEAN members, like Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, so that those countries can also benefit from economic integration. And then we have ASEAN +1 FTAs with China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, and India. So now moving to our new document on AEC 2025, what we observe that we have now new headings. We no longer call single market and production base. So our policymakers are listening to us. They understood how people reacted to this big phrase of single market production base. So we no longer say it that way. We say it's a highly integrated and cohesive economy. We see the word people in the headline of the commitments, a resilient, inclusive, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN. So there again. And connectivity. Connectivity is also important. You cannot just say lower tariff and that is good enough for economic integration. You need institutional connectivity, which is your customs. You need efficient custom systems. You need hard infrastructure. You need people to understand all these things. So connectivity is important to deliver on economic integration. So these are the 5 new pillars under AEC 2025. And this is what it says. I will say, just glance through the underlined words, and the key among these 6 points are 2, 4, and 6. Number 2 is about business-friendly, trade facilitative, market-driven. So this is what I've been saying, like ASEAN facilitate the market-driven integration. It has to be inclusive for all kind of businesses, small, big, medium, everyone should be part of this economic integration process, and we need better infrastructure. These are the 3, I think, the key motto for the AEC 2025 blueprint. This is how the blueprint is further divided across 30 elements and action lines. I won't go through this. This includes many new agendas also, like e-commerce, good governance, like engaging stakeholders. So these are further divided into 500 action lines. This year, we have come up with this. This is similar to the blueprint. We call this Consolidated Strategic Action Plan. This is adopted earlier in February. Like I said, it involves action line, more than 500 are there across the 5 characteristics. So basically, it's the implementation tool. How are we going to implement these 5 measures? And it's basically to increase transparency, a communication device between the government and the people. People need to understand how you're going to deliver an innovative region. But most importantly, the document says it's a living document, and it will be periodically revised. So don't say, like, as of now, e-commerce is important, it will be there in the agenda. It may be get removed next time if something else comes up, or it can take less priority also. So depending on how the global economy is changing, ASEAN also changes. I won't talk about these. These are basically, I have listed some key priority for ASEAN countries in the next couple of years. These 2 slides will give you some idea what Singapore and Thailand are looking forward to deliver in the next 2 years. What is my understanding from this strategic blueprint? There are 3 kinds of deadline. One I said is the short term, which Singapore and Thailand has to deliver soon. Then there are action lines, which says words like explore possibilities, strengthen cooperation, which I think is very broad to accommodate all 10 countries' interest. Then there are some activities which has a deadline till 2025. By that, I understand it's a politically sensitive issue, and it will always remain a work in progress. So don't expect any quick result on that. Taxation and governance was not elaborated much. And then there are other supplementary blueprints for other actions of AEC main document. We have a better, I'll be finishing soon in 2 minutes. In the AEC 2025, we have a better monitoring mechanism, because in AEC 2015, we had a scorecard kind of thing where we only said yes or no. We didn't say much about how far that yes is good or bad. We just said yes, it's done. Even if it's done by one country, or it's partly done by a country, it's yes. But it didn't serve much of the purpose. So this time we have a much more robust system. So we have a compliance monitoring where I showed you the action lines. It will be measured whether the country is delivered on that. There'll be outcome monitoring, where the delivery will be measured against ASEAN statistics. Like how far, if you establish the e-customs, your trade time goes down in a country. And impact evaluation will be how much trade has gone up because of that lower cost and delivery time in ASEAN. And there could be verification from ASEAN Secretariat or third party. I won't go through this. There are a lot of achievements in ASEAN. ASEAN is very enticing manufacturing base. We have operations from US, South Korea, Europe. We have enterprises operating in the region. And within ASEAN also, like different countries specializes in different things. Singapore is on the, it ranks top for, say, pharmaceutical product. Thailand is for automotive business. Currently, these countries are looking for aerospace manufacturing, which is, again, a production fragmentation process. So we are in the different kind of manufacturing activities. Then there is some progress under financial market, infrastructure, tourism, digital economy, and even in agriculture. So I think if organizer can distribute the slides, you can see these in a bit more detail. So these are my concluding remarks. ASEAN is an economically impressive region, but let's note that ASEAN economic cooperation is incremental in nature. We cannot think why ASEAN doesn't behave like Singapore and is already thinking like smart nation. No. ASEAN has Myanmar, ASEAN has Cambodia, who is still struggling with very basic issues in their domestic economy. So it will be slow. It is a continuous effort to facilitate market-driven integration. So whatever is happening, the governments will facilitate that. AEC 2015 had a high implementation rate, though people didn't understand much about that. Now we have moved to the next phase of AEC 2025, where we observe that the policy document has improved. We have a better monitoring and evaluation framework. In the next 2 years, I believe ASEAN will focus more on trade facilitation, raising awareness, competition policy and consumer protection, tourism, ICT infrastructure, and better connectivity for MSMEs. And ASEAN economic cooperation has introduced growth momentum in several sectors. I have given you a few examples. So ASEAN is on track for economic integration, but we are unlikely to hear anything big bang under ASEAN Economic Community. We won't be ASEAN Customs Union anytime soon. This is a period of consolidation when ASEAN will build on its earlier measures. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sanchita. I will just say a few words on Sanchita's presentation. I'll just say that, that the ASEAN economy is a very successful one. We are growing and growing at a much faster rate than the world economy. The world has indicated its confidence in us by investing in ASEAN. ASEAN is able to attract more foreign direct investment than even China or India. And we are integrating our 10 economies, transforming them into a single market and production base. There is, however, a gap between what we in the public sector, what the officials say, and what our private sector colleagues say. As far as we in the public sector is concerned, we convince ourselves that by the end of 2015, we have already accomplished our goal of achieving an ASEAN economic community. But when I ask my private sector friends whether this is their experience on the ground, they say no, that there are still gaps. There are non-tariff barriers. So the flow of goods, services between and among the 10 ASEAN countries is still not seamless and barrier-free. So this is a point that we can discuss later. Our third speaker is a colleague, Dr. TANG Siew Mun. Is a colleague from the NUS Law School where she teaches, and she's also a colleague from the Center for International Law. Siew Mun plays a very important role in the work of the Center for International Law. She's a co-director of our program on ASEAN law and policy. And although she's very young, she had the previous incarnation when she was the co-director with a very famous professor at NYU Law School, Professor Joseph Weiler. She was the co-director with Joe Weiler of a multi-million-dollar research project on ASEAN integration through law. Yeah, and we're still trying to complete this project with the last couple of books. A few years ago, ASEAN published a very good book on the ASEAN Intergovernmental on Human Rights. And she's currently writing 2 more books. Sandy going to speak to us on the legal and institutional transformation in ASEAN.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm very, very honored and happy to be here. So I've just come from teaching 3 hours on ASEAN law and policy, and well, it is nice to share more on ASEAN law and policy with you today. So, you know, my colleagues Siew Mun and Sanchita have talked about across the 3 pillars of the ASEAN community. So the political security community, the economic community, and the socio-cultural community, which form, you know, the entire ASEAN community, the 3 pillars of ASEAN. And that is, you know, the substantive content of what the ASEAN community is. My role is, as a lawyer, as an international lawyer, is, you know, it comes to the unsexy parts, right? You know, it's laws, it's rules, it's institutions. So these are the tracks, railway tracks or the roads on which the strategic and substantive contents, the aspirational ideals that we are going to develop in ASEAN will move on. So Siew Mun has talked about the 50 years of ASEAN, or rather 50 or 18 years of ASEAN, if we're talking about ASEAN 10, Sanchita has brought us through all the years of economic development. Where I am talking really is, you know, we are only 10 years of ASEAN in the rules-based community. In 2007, ASEAN, this was the breakthrough period. From a political, diplomatic, international organization, we wanted to transform, and Prof. Koh was an integral member of, you know, the ASEAN Charter process and the new developments of ASEAN. ASEAN wanted to transform into a rules-based international organization. So what did this mean? We not only first proclaim that we have legal personality, but then, as in the ASEAN Charter preamble, it says, we, the member states of, you know, ASEAN, are committed to intensifying community building across the 3 pillars through enhanced regional cooperation and integration, so cooperation in the political security community, socio-cultural community, and integration in the economic community. And because of all these structures, we hereby establish through this charter, and this is law, this is hard law, the legal and institutional framework of ASEAN, or for ASEAN, on the 40th anniversary. So when we turned 40. So this year we turned 50. So 10 years of ASEAN in, you know, the rules of law and the rule of institutions of the ASEAN community. So really, ASEAN and the ASEAN Charter have brought about 2 main breakthroughs to my mind: rule of law and the rule of institutions. So what does this really mean? This means that we can better deal with all the strategic, economic, and political, you know, imbalances or shaky ground or whatever challenges we see in the years ahead. And how do we do this? Well, we need a lot of improvement, okay? So first thing was that we wanted to have the ASEAN Charter, and the eminent persons group prior to the drafting of the ASEAN Charter said, we want to have the respect for law. And to do so, we need to see greater legal compliance. And Siew Mun and Sanchita have said that, you know, we have blueprints, we have strategic plans, but we're not really seeing the full fruition of all this. So what, as lawyers, not just strategic plans, but the real laws, the treaties, the agreements, and other soft laws, we should see greater compliance through all the commitments that ASEAN has made, okay? Then we talk about some examples. The ASEAN community was supposed, well, it was actually established on 31st December 2015, so about 18 months ago, well, slightly more than 18 months ago. But the fanfare in the news was all about the ASEAN Economic Community, and there was much skepticism from the private sector and even from, well, I guess unspoken, but from the public sector, also about the unfulfillment of all the ASEAN Charter goals for 2015. Okay? And now, recently, I think in July or August, the Asian Development Bank has actually tabled how many, you know, measures, which number in the hundreds, of the unfulfillment of the blueprints for the ASEAN community. So it's not just 93%, was it, Sanchita, you said? But, you know, if it's 500 measures and about 100 or 100 and more measures are unfulfilled, that's, you know, only 80% achievement. And if you're a lawyer, and if you are, you know, a policymaker and you want to see greater compliance, you should see something about in the 90%, 95% range, not something as 80%, and definitely not in the 100 measures and more which are unfulfilled, right? So the critical question is why, you know, legal compliance is faltering, especially when we are committed to the rule of law in institutions. The Eminent Persons Group, and this is a very important report that was published in 2007 prior to the adoption of the ASEAN Charter. The critical reason why ASEAN wanted to commit to the rule of law in institutions was because we need to integrate because of the competition from China and India. We are really, you know, if you see India as a whole market, China as a whole market, ASEAN is not yet an integrated market. We're integrating, but we are not yet an integrated market. We are already behind the curve, and there are so many more years that we need to catch up on. So if the critical factor is competition, that will gear us up towards rule of law and rule of institutions, the one question to ask ourselves is, why isn't this threat of competition and of being overtaken even more not compelling us to greater legal compliance on the promises that we have made? Because the promises that we have made among one another in the ASEAN 10, they are supposed to bring about a greater common good collectively and to each of the 10 ASEAN member states. So maybe a secondary question to ask is this collective agreement, or, you know, in terms of economic, sociocultural, or political security agreements, are those benefits in those collective agreements less than the benefits that member states would get from bilateral agreements with bigger and external partners? One question, right? Something to ask ourselves. Another question about the lack of compliance would be more neutral. The lack of capacity. You know, we don't even need to look at the lower developing country, member states of the ASEAN community. What about, you know, middle developing countries? That is also a great lag in terms of, you know, where we want to be in terms of our ambitions. So there is a lag, and in terms of capacity for more developed members, middle developing members, and low developing members. Where are our incapacities and what is being done to address them? Okay? And so after class, I spoke with a student, and I think she tried to come to Tembusu College, but she's now in CAPT. And she said that in Tembusu, the focus is more on international relations, world politics, you know, current affairs, and so, you know, your curriculum is directed to this. So perhaps you are international relation scholars as well. So, you know, and we know in international law and international relations, the actors are very, very mindful of credibility and reputational issues. So, in the international order, if you break an international law or you break a code among the member states, you are going to suffer, well, a substantial credibility loss, a reputational loss. So, when ASEAN member states do not fulfill their agreements, which they have built among themselves, or worse, with the external partners, how come this threat of the undermining of their credibility, why doesn't this, impel them or compel them to gear up on their compliance? Okay, so that's one technical level on credibility and capacity. The next thing is that we have, and this goes down to the law. One way that lawyers have seen, or is quite a method which international lawyers use is, or lawyers would generally use to compel compliance, would be through dispute settlement mechanisms. But maybe we need to reassess how these dispute settlement mechanisms are being utilized. They're not being utilized at all in ASEAN at the moment, but under the ASEAN Charter, Chapter 8 of the ASEAN Charter, there are dispute settlement mechanisms for all types of ASEAN disputes and interpretation issues on the agreements. So there will be dispute settlement mechanisms, but we should really ask again whether dispute settlement mechanisms are, the primary way to compel compliance. Perhaps other ways of compelling compliance would be monitoring systems. So through the ASEAN Secretariat and the national secretariats, we know what we do in our own countries, what the ministries are doing in terms of implementation, and this sort of monitoring and reporting system would help to increase compliance rather than, through a stick mechanism of the dispute settlement mechanism. Because that is, after the violation, then you go to dispute settlement mechanism. Why not avoid it in the first place through regular monitoring and reporting systems? Okay, so these are questions which not only confound scholars, but I have counterparts, my colleagues in the international law departments or the state legal departments, and they're very perplexed when they see all these issues, and they're wondering why we, apart from these systemic issues, why we do not craft better legal agreements in the region. So that might come to a capacity issue, that might come to be come down to a political will issue. So what do I mean in terms of, getting more legal infrastructure in terms of bringing about better compliance? So first, we need a repository of all the ASEAN legal agreements out there. Up to now, we do not have an exact count of the ASEAN laws which are available or which exist. Okay, the ASEAN Secretariat doesn't have it, the ASEAN member states don't have it. And then the full set of travaux preparatoire for each ASEAN agreement. We do not understand the background, we do not have a common context and background to how each ASEAN agreement is being negotiated. As far as we know, every member state has their own understanding, but there's no collective understanding which can be brought up in terms of when there are treaty interpretation rules to be deciphered, or when there are treaty confusions to be worked out. Okay? The second thing now we come to is, I've spoken on the rule of law, now we come to the rule of institutions. So, we saw in the ASEAN Charter, this is a legal and institutional framework, and the ASEAN Charter has put in place a new institutional framework. I've spoken about the ASEAN Secretary General and the ASEAN Secretariat. Some of the institutional restructuring that has been very welcome is more recently would be the monitoring and analysis division for each of the three communities. So I said, monitoring would help gain better compliance. And as of, I think, January last year, so January 2016, every ASEAN community pillar now has a monitoring unit. Not all the spaces are filled in the monitoring units, but this is a start. Secondly, in the ASEAN Secretariat, we have a legal department, the LSAD, Legal Services and Agreements Division. And instead of just one small division, they have now segregated it into 3 departments, and 2 of these are very, very useful for greater compliance. One is the Treaty Division, and the other is the International Economic and Trade Law Division in the Legal Services and Agreements Directorate. Okay? And then lastly, I would like to touch on would be, I guess, for students of government or political science or politics, I think you would be familiar with, the concepts of good governance. And one, good governance not only means law and institutions, but also means greater transparency. So we need to have greater information shared among the member states and among those personnel who work in ASEAN. Because, how can you work when you do not know what is happening in the other department or in the other member state? And really coming to the last point, I think, Siew Mun has talked about political will, and Santita has talked about, what the ASEAN member states are going to project into the future. I would like to talk a bit about along the same lines. So this would be supranationality versus the rule of law and institutions. So there is a misconception, perhaps by the ASEAN member states and maybe the political leaders of the ASEAN member states, is that, okay, on one hand, you want to have greater, law and institutions in ASEAN. On the other hand, there's a misconception that by following the rule of law and institutions in ASEAN, you are ceding your sovereignty, your sovereign rights, and ASEAN as an organization gains supranational powers over you. That is really not going to happen, because the power structure in ASEAN that is now and will be in successive generations to come, this ASEAN will remain an intergovernmental organization, and there is no ceding of sovereignty if we let laws and institutions do their job. Thank you.
At this stage in the program, we invite the speakers to take seats in the podium and invite members of the audience to go to one of the 2 microphones on either side. And before you ask a question, please identify yourself and identify your college or your faculty, where you're from. And please try to keep to 1 question at a time.
I just want to make one comment on Sandy's presentation. I had the privilege of chairing the high-level task force in 2007, which drafted the ASEAN Charter. And the Charter came into force in 2008. I think this is a very important milestone in ASEAN development. We have made an important transition from an organization that relies on networks, on consensus, on informality, to an organization that would rely or would give greater reliance to law and institutions. It is, however, a transition that will take many years. Because it's not just what is in the Charter, but how do you translate what's in the Charter to reality? You have to make a cultural transition. And I say that in many ASEAN countries, there isn't the legal culture that you need in order to support the Charter. So it's a work in progress, Siew Mun's phrase. The implementation of the Charter, the transformation of ASEAN from a very informal, network-based, consensus-based institution to one that increasingly relies on law and institution is a work in progress. But it is nevertheless a very important milestone. Yeah. So we are now ready to take your questions. So will the students who wish to ask a question, please use the microphones. Please introduce yourself and then ask your question and tell us who you would like the question to be answered by. Please.
Hi.
Hi.
Good evening. I'm Chelsea, a year 2 accounting student. I would like to direct my question to probably Professor Tommy Koh and also other panelists who think are relevant to you.
Okay.
So my question is actually, because I have 2 questions. So one question is from my observation. I've observed that China, under its One Belt, One Road initiative, right, it seeks to engage all the ASEAN countries like individually rather than collectively as a whole ASEAN group. My second observation is that Singapore seems to be left out in China's engagements with all the other ASEAN countries. So my question is that the case and why? And second question is, how can ASEAN collectively embrace One Belt, One Road? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, since you asked me and the panel, I will begin by saying that your perception that Singapore is being left out from China's initiatives, whether it be Belt and Road or AIIB, is not true. How could we be left out when we are the largest foreign investor in China? We are the only foreign country that has iconic government-to-government projects. The Suzhou Industrial Park, the Tianjin Eco-City, and now the Chongqing Connectivity Project. So Singapore is very involved in China. We have very close relations between our government, between our business community, between civil society. Yeah, and this perception that you have that we are being left out is not true. But I will ask my colleagues to reflect on how ASEAN as a group is engaging China, both on the Belt and Road Initiative and otherwise. Who would like to, maybe you'd like to begin, Siew Mun?
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Koh. Thank you for the question. If I may, as a non-Singaporean, venture an opinion on Singapore being left out. I think it's a misunderstanding and it's inaccurate. We have to understand what is being left out. Singapore does not need assistance to build MRT, to build roads. You're very capable of doing them yourselves, right? You have the financing, you have the manpower, but we should look at Singapore's role in OBO in a very different perspective. It is not about money coming in, it's not assistance, but Singapore plays an indispensable role in providing training for Malaysians, Laotians, and Thais, training the technicians, engineers, and the coordination and the financing is done through Singapore. So Singapore's role in OBO will be very different from countries that require FDI, they require infrastructure assistance, working with China. So in this sense, Singapore is not a recipient in a normal, conventional sense, but Singapore is a partner. And I mean, my friends educate me that even before OBO was formally launched, Singapore had participated in assisting and partnering China to link up within China and also out of China through the Chongqing initiative. So Singapore's role is very unique here. And in fact, there is one Chinese government report from Chinese government source that says that 30% of Chinese funding for OBO comes through Singapore. So again, we see a very different role that Singapore is playing in the sense that as a financial hub, as the planning, and so on. Last point about China engaging the ASEAN member states individually rather than as a collective. I think that is a practical move because most of the deals are actually bilateral. For example, in terms of Malaysia, if you're going to build something in Malaysia, you need the Malaysian government's concurrence in terms of the land acquisition and the deals and the loans. It is not a collective, it's not a regional issue. There's no point talking to ASEAN Secretariat, there's no point talking to Thailand because everything is actually internal in that sense. If there's a project that overlaps, that links up two countries, perhaps then will be a multilateral engagement. So at this point, I think it's a matter of the practicality of China engaging the ASEAN member states individually, as it has done with other partners in Pakistan, in Central Europe, in other parts of Asia as well. Thank you.
Sanchita, you want to say something about China-ASEAN economic cooperation?
Yeah, no, I'll just add to the OBOR thing, what Siew Mun has mentioned. I'll just add to that. Like every ASEAN country has its unique economic characteristics. And China's OBOR policy is more bilateral at the moment because policies or rules of every country is different. China cannot give the money to ASEAN Secretariat. ASEAN Secretariat is not a government. The money has to come through a government or from a private sector to another investor in the country. And regarding your question on the ASEAN, how ASEAN collectively can embrace OBOR is one way to do is to identify the cross-border OBOR projects or ASEAN project. Like ASEAN also has a master plan for ASEAN connectivity document, and it identifies both within a country, individual country projects and cross-border projects. Like we have Singapore Kunming railway line that runs from Singapore to KL to Malaysia to Thailand, Vietnam, Laos to China, Kunming. So this is across multiple countries. It needs harmonization of infrastructure, the rail lines, the tracks, harmonization of policies across the border. So that is where I think ASEAN need to take a collective position. So ASEAN, they need to identify the cross-border infrastructure projects, come up to a common position, and then negotiate with China. And it's happening under Master Plan of ASEAN Connectivity.
Okay. Another question, please.
Okay, thank you.
This side of the room, nobody here has a question? Yes, please.
A very good evening, everyone. Prof. Koh, distinguished guests, honored guests, and everyone here in Tembusu College. My name is Yash. I'm a year 1 student in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. I intend to take political science. My question today is slightly different from what everyone else has spoken, all the speakers have spoken about today. It's primarily on the Rohingya crisis that is going on in one of our ASEAN member countries in Myanmar. In light of what's going on in Myanmar recently, would you say that ASEAN's negotiation style is a severe roadblock in mitigating the problem? Because we have seen ASEAN being a very successful in negotiating the Cambodian crisis in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So what can ASEAN do to further mitigate the problem that's going on in Myanmar currently? Thank you.
I was hoping somebody would ask the question. It's a difficult question, and I think we should give you a good answer. If I could rephrase the question, Siew Mun. Why is ASEAN silent? Why is ASEAN unable to take any positive action in the face of this humanitarian crisis in the Rakhine state of Myanmar? Could you answer that?
Are we on the record or off the record?
Are there any people from the media here? Berita Harian, right? Yeah, on the record. But if you want your answer to this question to be off the record, we can do that.
I hope that when you quote me, do not get me into trouble. I'll try to give you my frank answer.
Yeah.
It's a very delicate question for ASEAN because first and foremost, there is this norm of non-interference, right? This is not just a norm unique to ASEAN. It is a norm unique. It is a norm that is applicable to all nation states. No nation would welcome other leaders to make comments on its domestic political systems, political and so on. And on this particular issue, it's more sensitive, quote unquote, because if any particular leader were to make any remarks that may not be complementary to the leadership, right, to the Myanmar leadership, how would they play out domestically? So we have to be sensitive. And also the way ASEAN works is that it is better to work with the Myanmar leadership to be against the Myanmar leadership. So ASEAN works in the more informal and out of the glare. We don't do megaphone diplomacy. It's quite interesting case to study the contrast of Malaysia's response and Indonesia's response to the Rohingya issue before it was blown up to the current situation. At certain time, the Malaysian Prime Minister Najib even questioned Aung San Suu Kyi's Nobel Peace Prize, right? And maybe suggest that she's undeserving, she should step up and so on, and there were protests in Malaysia. That is one case, one example of handling it. Indonesia took a very different tack, in the sense that Indonesia's foreign minister spoke with the Myanmar leadership, visited, engaged, out of the glare, and did not try to gain political mileage domestically or externally about it. The result was Indonesia managed to send humanitarian aid to the Rohingya people, right? Malaysia's humanitarian aid was stopped. So in that sense, if we are trying to make a difference to help the Rohingya people, to feed them, to provide blankets, medicine that is urgently needed, who was more successful? I would say definitely Indonesia, because it has to make an impact on the ground. But if the consideration for the Malaysian leadership is to gain political mileage domestically, it's a different calculation in that sense. So as far as ASEAN is concerned, in terms of regional unity and how we handle issues within, which is a better model? One, to name and shame, to embarrass the country you're supposed to help, or the other one to help in a more refined manner, perhaps. It may take a lot of patience. You will not win political brownie points domestically, but I think the second way will be better.
Maybe you shouldn't use the word refined manner. Maybe you should say more Javanese manner. Sandy, difficult question, but an important one.
So maybe if I could broaden your question not just to the Rohingya crisis, but the general human rights situation in Myanmar. You know, it has been going on for decades, right? And if we see, and just to expand on what Siew Mun has said, you know, we work on a consensus basis, and ASEAN has the principle of non-interference. But this doesn't mean that even if collectively ASEAN looks silent and looks as if it's not doing anything, but actually bilaterally there are, you know, talks going on, persuasions going on, and, you know, and all these are covert until we see a breakthrough and it's written about in the media. So, you know, that is one way. So sometimes ASEAN can be criticized rightly, but sometimes also, very often, it has been criticized wrongly for not doing anything. And, you know, and for the Myanmar government, of course, now it's a democratic government, but in terms of extreme crises and great international pressure, it will then relent a bit. So, and, you know, let's say the Cyclone Nargis, the humanitarian crisis, there was great international pressure, and ASEAN collectively did something. Yeah, and the Saffron Revolution as well. Yeah.
Yeah, if I may, two other considerations. One is the notion of ASEAN community. Yeah, if we want to introduce a regional thinking that we are one, yeah, should ASEAN take a stand, or perhaps to be more active in addressing the issues, whether it's ethnic cleansing, whether it's genocide, human rights, yeah? We should not see this as these are Myanmaris and I'm a Malaysian, I'm a Singaporean, I'm a bit detached. Let the people at ASEAN Secretariat, other people handle it. If we are a community, then it matters in that sense. And I think the recipient country in Myanmar should understand that it is not interference but assistance in that sense. It needs a change of mindset. Easier said than done. in a very theoretical sense, it works, but in a practical sense, in a political sense, it's very costly to all sides. The other question is ASEAN's credibility is at stake. If everybody is talking from the United Nations, US, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, practically the whole world is talking about it, can ASEAN as an organization, as an entity, afford to remain silent? Yeah? ASEAN works like a duck in water. Above water, you don't see anything serene, but underwater, you'll be busy paddling to stay afloat. That's how ASEAN works. But at certain time, that the Secretary General of the ASEAN or the chair needs to say something in that sense, yeah? Of course, I think it should be better in consultation with the Myanmar leadership what to be said, and we should not do the name and shame game, but in a more respectful manner, we do have to have a voice in this issue, because if we don't talk, people will be talking to us in that sense. We should be in a discussion, and we should take control of the narrative in assistance and in consultation with the Myanmar leadership.
I was wondering whether my good friend Kun Temsak wants to make any comment on this issue. Yes or no?
Thank you, Professor Tommy. Well, since we talk about the principle of non-interference, I think in the ASEAN Charter, member government already add in 2 more new principles. If you read the list of ASEAN principles, you'll find that we have a new principle about collective responsibility toward enhancing peace, security, prosperity in our region. That's one. Another new principle included in the ASEAN Charter is the notion of enhanced consultation on matters seriously affecting common interests of ASEAN. Certainly what's happening to the Rohingya people is affecting ASEAN common interest, ASEAN reputation as a sharing, caring community. Certainly ASEAN member governments have a responsibility to help Myanmar government find a solution to this humanitarian crisis based on these 2 new principles.
Thank you, Kun Tamsak. I'm sure when ASEAN leaders meet in Manila in November, behind closed door, I'm sure that the issue will be discussed by some of them. Thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Another question, please.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm Ruben. I am from Geography and Political Science. My question is there's been a lot of talk about how ASEAN has been successful, but what are to you, the panel, the most disappointing aspects of ASEAN? What has ASEAN not made its mark on yet? Yeah, that's my question.
Your question is, what are the
Sorry.
biggest disappointments, is it?
Yes.
I mean, the topic is success or disappointment, so
Yeah.
maybe I'll ask each of them.
Right.
So can each of you share with him your 3 biggest disappointments? So I start with Sanchita. What are the 3 biggest disappointments?
Okay. Biggest disappointment for ASEAN, if we see the concrete measures in the AEC blueprint, okay? AEC document gives the vision, but then there was a blueprint which gives action line, right? And in the action lines, if I just take into consideration the concrete deliverable, like modernize your custom system, what do I see? Singapore has modernized and have an e-custom systems long back. Malaysia also have. But the other countries, Thailand also started sometime in early 2000. But there are other countries who are supposed to do it in line with AEC, they failed. And this is a very important thing to raise the intra-regional trade. And if you ask me why, first is have a modernized custom system or e-customs, you need the understanding. It's not just technical IT understanding, but you need legal people to craft the document in your national economy. How are you accepting this e-system? So you need lawyers. You need, of course, IT people. But the question comes is, does these IT people understand AEC? It's not like, okay, you are an engineer. So often it's seen that these IT people, they don't know what is AEC. And so they're not in hurry to implement something by 2015 or the deadline given. And then there is monetary resources. The money, is it a priority for the government? So, or there is some other national agenda to maybe build a bridge which will get the political leader more votes in the next election. Is that a priority? Because everything is political economy. So implementing the key economic agenda, I would say ASEAN is not doing well. And in the next blueprint, ASEAN should buck up on that.
Sandy, do you have any disappointment? Oh. Yeah, you do?
Sorry, did it sound like I was going to have a laundry list? But 3 only, right? Yeah, so, yes, of course. So I think one of the big promises, but understated promises would be that we would review the ASEAN Charter after 5 years, and also a key ASEAN document. So then also the, for AICHA, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, we were supposed to have a review after 5 years as well. So these two reviews, which were supposed to happen, have not yet taken place, and because at the discussions at that time, to have the review process, we could, push things further or take away things that, had already been implemented, and then so on and so forth. Then the second one is that, the disappointment.
So wait,
sorry.
Your first disappointment
is that
the review didn't take place.
Yeah, review didn't.
But why don't you turn it around and say maybe we did such a good job drafting the charter.
But we know that's not true.
It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to be amended.
Oh, but then you see, there are incremental progresses, right? Okay. The second disappointment is that there is a disconnect between the public sector, which is, governmental level, and the private sector and, just a regular society. So the ASEAN community, the good of all these trade deals, greater investment flows, greater GDP, GNP, and all that, that should all flow down to, human society, private corporations. Everyone needs a job. We need economic development, but then we don't really see the connect, and the real-time substantive benefit to, all of us ASEAN citizens. So that is a real disappointment to me. And then the third is, in terms of human rights, I think because we are, it has been scattered throughout the ASEAN Charter that we are legally obligated and we are going to respect human rights and international law, standards, international standards. But our human rights standards at the regional level are subpar. We are not, in sync with the international human rights laws which ASEAN member states have signed. I know there are different treaties that each state has signed, but I think we could get a higher standard, really. Yeah.
Are you criticizing the ASEAN Declaration, or are you criticizing the practice
both,
of the AICHA?
Both.
Both.
Oh yeah. On the human rights bodies, I think a simple thing would be to have more publicity and transparency, because we know that they're not idle. They're actually working pretty hard, but it would be good to know what they're actually doing. Yeah.
But maybe on the last disappointment, I would say that you expect too much. No, I'm serious. I mean, Tembusu and I were together working for the whole year 2007. I think having an agreement to establish the Human Rights Commission was already a miracle, Yeah. I mean, there were times when the two of us wondered whether we could get a consensus to set up any kind of Human Rights Commission. You remember back in 2007, only 5 ASEAN countries had national commissions of human rights, and the others did not, So it was quite extraordinary that we arrived at a consensus to set up a Human Rights Commission, and to have an ASEAN Declaration. It's another miracle. But we have to move at a pace acceptable to the slowest member of the family. So I would plead for patience. Siew Mun, do you have any disappointment?
I'm disappointed in your question. Part of my working pass only allows me to say good things about ASEAN because we are ASEAN Studies Centre. But jokes aside, three things perhaps. One is ASEAN. Does ASEAN believe in ASEAN? Does member states believe in ASEAN? Not in terms of where the money is, not in terms of where the funding is. I give you an example of the ASEAN Foundation, which was established to promote ASEAN awareness, bring ASEAN together, and all this is money. Yeah, education, conferences, youth, yeah, culture, and all sorts of things. Without money, well, you can't organize things. You can't bring ASEAN together. You can't bring Southeast Asia together. But where is ASEAN's funding to fully fund ASEAN Foundation? Right? If you believe in something, we should fund it to the maximum. Of course, good governance will see the money is properly used. Right? I think it's high time that ASEAN reduce and stop looking to the dialogue partners for funding for development projects. It seems that the dialogue partners like the EU, the Americans, the Canadians, yeah, Australia, for example, they give us a lot of money to do women empowerment projects, good governance, women's rights, education, health, yeah. Why are we not funding this ourselves, right? Shouldn't we set a common pool of money in that sense? So I'm not saying that we should turn away the assistance of the dialogue member states. But in terms of the optics itself, if we rely too much on outsiders, it shows that we are not willing to put our money where our mouth is in that sense. And I think ASEAN Foundation should be better funded and should be perhaps 95% funded by the ASEAN member states themselves, and also review from time to time to make sure that there is money for the youth, for other things as well. So funding, one matter. Second thing, perhaps incrementally, ASEAN member states, the leadership, should have a little bit more trust on ASEAN Secretariat and ASEAN itself. Example of the Committee of Permanent Representatives. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the ASEAN elders here, it was established so that to cut the red tape, so that some decisions can be made in Jakarta by the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which are representing the ASEAN member states. Instead of referring back to Kuala Lumpur, to Manila, to Vientiane, we have somebody in Kuala Lumpur, in Jakarta that can make decisions matter of days, perhaps, instead of months in that sense. But they are not empowered to make decisions. So things are still going back to the capitals in that sense. Is this because they don't trust the system? I don't think we should go to the Brussels model. Yeah, that is a bit too extreme. But we should have a little bit more trust so that the system works in a more refined manner, to sort of give it more speed. Last point is, this is quite superficial, my superficial understanding of ASEAN. At least in a very generic sense, ASEAN matters most to the ASEAN member states as a once-in-a-decade phenomenon. When you are chairing ASEAN, very important. You see flags everywhere, all sorts of ASEAN events. But when you hand over the ASEAN chairmanship to the next year, they say, wow, thank goodness it's over. We have another 9 years to cultivate interest again. ASEAN should be an enduring interest, day in, day out, 365 days, every year, not just because when you're chairing ASEAN. That is how you build awareness, this is how you create a community. So interest in ASEAN should not be fleeting, it should not be confined to just the chairmanship year.
I'm sure Gerard and his colleagues think about ASEAN, dream about ASEAN day and night, whether he's chairman or not. Am I right? Am I right? Thank you for your question. There are two here. Huh? Let me take. Why don't we take two questions at a time?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Dylan. I'm a year 2 business student. So my question would be mostly about the ASEAN way of doing things. So I believe that the ASEAN way of doing things has been serving the region well and the organization well for the past 50 years. But now we look at the South China Sea. We look at how China has been militarizing the islands there. And we have a bunch of ASEAN members who have maybe competing interests in the region. And we have China with varying degrees of influence and interest in ASEAN member states. So I was wondering if the ASEAN way of doing things moving forward be robust enough to handle these regional challenges, and whether ASEAN will be better off or worse off as a result of that.
All right, thank you for your question. Let's take all the questions. It's almost 9 o'clock, so let's take all the questions and then I'll ask each panelist to try to give a composite answer. The lady here, please.
Hi, I'm Clarissa. I'm a year 1 medicine student. I have 2 questions actually. First one is, in view of like the increasingly divisive global political landscape, right? How far do you think the consensus decision-making process in ASEAN will go and can go? And my second question is, I find that I observe that one of the special features of ASEAN is that between the countries, there's a very great disparity economically as compared to organizations like the EU. EU countries are mostly developed countries. So do you think that this is a problem that will impede our progress as a collective intergovernmental organization?
Thank you. 2 very good questions. So it's ASEAN way, and then the development gap between ASEAN member states. Let's hear your question.
Hi everyone, I'm Ryan. I'm a year 2 BS Econs double degree student. It's a question for Ms. Sanchita. For us citizens here in ASEAN, when the AEC was signed, it felt like a bit like business as usual, and we don't really feel a material impact. I think Dr. Tan's also mentioned something like it doesn't really trickle down to the people. So how would you say the implementation of the AEC impacts people in ASEAN? Like in a tangible way, sort of.
Okay, thank you. Good question. Yes, please.
Hi, good evening. I'm Jong Rui. I'm a psychology student. So my question is a follow-up of her question. So bearing in mind that ASEAN has a non-intervention kind of approach, how can ASEAN help the lesser developed member nations along and try to catch up with the other more developed nations?
Can you repeat your question, please?
How can more developed member nations of ASEAN help the less developed nations to catch up?
Okay, all right, good. Very good questions, actually, yeah, all the questions. Maybe we'll ask the panelists to answer in the reverse order, beginning with you, Sandy. Yeah, you can pick any questions that have been asked to answer. Consensus was an issue, ASEAN way, the development gap.
Okay, so maybe I'll take the economic cluster of questions together, on consensus, so that will remain for the foreseeable future. But then in the economic development or, economic cooperation aspect, we have the ASEAN minus X. So those who are, the member states who are, which are more ready to go ahead, they can go first with, a deadline for, the other member states to catch up in the future. And the thing is that you have a deadline for the other member states to actually catch up, right? In terms of how, I think there are capacity building projects where, Singapore does a lot of this in the other to, reaching out to the less developed member states of ASEAN, and other capacity building projects are also flowing in through external dialogue partners. Okay. Yeah.
I think on closing the development gap, Singapore initiated what is called IAI, the Initiative ASEAN Integration, and Singapore has put its money where its mouth is. We established capacity building centers in the capitals of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And we also bring the national to Singapore for training. But we don't have what the European Union has, a cohesion fund, where there's actual transfer of money from the richer country to the poorer country. There was no consensus to do any such thing. Sanchita, you're next.
Yeah, I will take your question on that consensus and how do we, the consensus question, especially from the economic point of view. Like, we need to keep in mind that the ASEAN countries are very different from each other, not only in terms of income, but in terms of human development indicators or even the business competitiveness. So yes, we have ASEAN minus X formula, where if 2 or 3 countries are ready, they can go ahead with the cooperation. But if we push too much to especially the laggard countries, I would say AEC will stop, the work will stop. So we need to be mindful that all countries should benefit. On this, another question on AEC and on 31st December, you didn't feel any material impact. We need to keep in mind that for any government AEC is one of the many policies. So we should not be putting too much of, like AEC cannot deliver everything for a country. Like for Singapore, we have monetary policy, fiscal policy, 34 free trade agreements, AEC. So there are many, there is a bunch of policies. So we cannot say one policy is for, say, 3 jobs or 4 jobs or 100 jobs. Second, like I mentioned, like all countries were not implementing the policies at the same time. Implementation is national responsibility. It's not of ASEAN as a whole or ASEAN's responsibility. So if the national economies are not adopting those regional policies in their platform, we may not see the benefits coming to those countries. And of course, then there won't be much of region-wide benefit. So yes, we didn't see much benefit, but of course things are moving, and I think most of the focus is given to intra-regional trade. So rest of the thing are for long-term benefits.
Thank you, Sanchita. Siew Mun?
Thank you for the questions. I think the South China Sea is very complex. We can stay throughout the whole night and over the weekend to discuss it. I'll just perhaps focus on 2 dimensions. One is the misconception that ASEAN can resolve the South China Sea dispute. ASEAN has no material interest in resolving. ASEAN is to help the claimant states to manage the situation, to prevent the further escalation, so they create an environment for the member states, for the claimant states to discuss among themselves, whether bilaterally, trilaterally, and so on. So we need to have a clear understanding what ASEAN's boundaries are, what its objectives are. Because if we don't understand among ASEAN member states, among 10 countries, then external parties would also use that issue to say that South China Sea is not an issue, right? If there is a dispute, if South China Sea becomes a hotly contested situation and there's flaring up, there's a mini war, we'll be right in the middle of it. And we are all trading nations. Singapore will be affected, Malaysia will be affected, everybody will be affected because oil and gas and trade flows through the Straits of Malacca into the South China Sea. So South China Sea is not just a regional issue, it's a global issue. And it is also where ASEAN will be tested, whether can we step up to the plate to manage an issue which is right in our backyard, right? That's perhaps on South China Sea. On consensus, this is where the naive side of me comes out in the sense that, and also idealism, I think perhaps in the short term, it will be difficult to change the consensus decision making, especially in political security issues. But in the economic realm, there's already ASEAN minus X. Perhaps we can further push envelope into other areas, but perhaps not in my lifetime. But I think it's a failure of our imagination to not even discuss, just to say that it will not happen, let's not talk about it. Why not? Let's talk about it, because we may not achieve it, but in the process, we may have some kind of pressure on certain member states, because we have to manage our differences, because the member states, the leadership's characteristics, the social dynamics are gone. The karaoke sessions, the golf sessions that we may think is a waste of money, waste of time, but that actually builds friendship. That actually makes the senior officials and the ministers and the prime ministers talk in a less confrontational manner, talk in a very informal manner. You build friendships there, I think. Yeah, this is how diplomacy works, not when you're in a conference room, perhaps, and during tea breaks and so on. So we lose that momentum. Now the leaders are more business-like. We fly in, fly out, right? Very kind of Western way of doing this. We need to invest the time. So the karaoke sessions, the durian eating sessions are actually very important. So we have lost that. So if we're in the business kind of operation in terms of ASEAN, shouldn't we have a business kind of decision making? I think we should start the discussion. We may not get there, but hopefully in the process, we would make the ASEAN member, the leaders think that there is some virtue in the consensus, and consensus itself, there must be some flexibility. It's not ironclad. Thank you.
Thank you, Siew Mun. I'm going to close the forum, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to crystallize one inspiring thought that you want to share with the students about ASEAN? Yeah. So maybe I begin with you, Sanchita.
Thank you, Prof. Koh. One key thought I would say for everybody here is like, please believe in ASEAN. It is working. Be patient. It's about 10 different countries who are in different level of development, so things are a bit slow. Do ask questions to the governments about what's happening in ASEAN, how is progress happening, or what is this policy, and ask on the Facebook, on the social media. Now government is also very active on the social media, so you can ask questions, because raising awareness is not always a one-way street from the government to you. Sometimes you also have to take the responsibility and push the governments to answer the questions that you have in your mind. That's it.
Thank you. Important message. Believe in ASEAN, but also question ASEAN leaders. What's your message?
Oh, it's also about belief. So this is believe in the laws and institutions of ASEAN. You have to watch this space, yeah? And I say that because of my practical, day-to-day experience. So this is the third time I'm teaching my ASEAN Law and Policy class. So first time I taught it, but it was kind of a short notice. I had 20 students. Last year I had 40. And this year I have reached maximum capacity 50. And in law school, and that's huge, yeah? So, and I think the numbers will continue to be 50 for the years to come. So, future is yours.
Siew Mun?
Honestly, I have more or less the same answer. I think it's a Tommy Cole effect on us, yeah? Yes, I think ASEAN is a religion. It's a matter of faith. You have to believe. If you don't believe, you always criticize. But if you believe, you will work on it. And as we said, that there are a lot of flaws, but we have to keep pushing the envelope. We have to believe. Fundamentally, we have to ask a question. Are we better off with ASEAN or without ASEAN? For sure, we are better off, right? How much? Debatable, yeah? But 10% is better than 0. 15% is definitely better, right? I think we can improve. The other takeaway is ASEAN is not just about win-win. You will not win all the time. There are some times you have to give in, you have to concede, but at the end of the day, yeah, you do get benefits. Yeah, sectors benefit. As a collective, we are all better off. I think that is the most important messages, which means for ASEAN to progress further, especially in the economics field, where the low-hanging fruits have been plucked, we are eating them. We are now going into higher level FTAs, integration, which requires more sacrifices. So if you don't sacrifice, you will not get the benefits. So we have to endure the pain in order to taste success. So keep on believing. Thank you.
Greg and Michael, may I have your permission to bring this to a close? Let's give the 3 panelists another round of applause.
The session is over, so please do feel free to leave and take some of these messages with you. I particularly like the idea of forcing world leaders to do karaoke and play a round of golf with each other. So thank you all.